Every Sunday morning for 98 years, a woman named Hattie Monroe in Birmingham, Alabama, woke before dawn and sat at her kitchen window and watched the sky change. She did not know why she did this. She had done it for so long that the reason had dissolved into habit, and the habit had dissolved into something she no longer questioned. She made coffee. She sat. She watched the light come. She had described the feeling once to her granddaughter as a waiting feeling, not unpleasant, not urgent, just the sense of something not yet finished. Her granddaughter had said, "Grandma, what are you waiting for?" Hattie had said, "I genuinely do not know." And every Sunday morning for 98 years, a woman named Clara Briggs in Memphis, Tennessee, woke before dawn and sat at her kitchen window and watched the sky change. She too could not explain it. She had tried to, once, to her son, and the best she could produce was like something still out there. On the afternoon, those two women met on the stage of Family Feud in Atlanta, Georgia, introduced to each other by Steve Harvey, who was reading from a card he had been given 40 minutes earlier, and who had spent those 40 minutes trying to understand how to hold himself together for this moment. They looked at each other across 14 feet of studio floor, and Hattie Monroe said, in a voice that was 98 years old and completely steady, "Oh, there you are." Steve Harvey put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for 3 minutes. The audience of 300 people did not make a sound. It was a Friday in September, and the studio at Imageworks in Atlanta was running its final taping of the week. The Monroe family from Birmingham had arrived at 11. Hattie, her granddaughter Denise, Denise's husband Raymond, Hattie's great-nephew William, and William's wife Carol. The casting submission had been written by Denise, who described her grandmother as the sharpest 98-year-old alive, and who had enclosed, with the submission, a photograph of Hattie at the podium of her church giving an address for the congregation's centennial celebration, which the church's pastor had described as the best speech he had heard in 40 years of ministry. The production team had called Denise the next day. The Briggs family from Memphis had arrived separately, through a different entrance, at a different time. Clara, 98, her son Thomas, Thomas's daughter Renee, Clara's niece Josephine, and Josephine's husband Earl. The same arrangement. Separate green rooms. Separate briefings. A production team that had spent 11 weeks making sure two 98-year-old women would be standing in the same room at the correct moment. The story of how Hattie Monroe and Clara Briggs had ended up on opposite sides of the state of Alabama for 98 years was not a story of cruelty. It was a story of poverty and speed, and a medical system that, in 1927 in rural Mississippi, had very little capacity to process what had happened, and very little interest in slowing down to do it correctly. Their mother, a woman named Ida, had given birth to twins in a farmhouse outside Greenwood, Mississippi, without medical attendance. A neighbor woman had helped. Both girls had been born healthy. Ida had not been. She had died the following morning. Their father, a man named Thomas, who worked the fields and had 5 children already, and no means and no wife, had done what was done in 1927 in rural Mississippi, when a man with 5 children and no wife and no means acquired 2 more children at once. He had sent them to family. One to a cousin in Birmingham, one to a cousin in Memphis. Different cousins, different cities, different worlds, different last names. He had told neither cousin about the other, whether from shame or overwhelm or the specific paralysis of a man who has lost everything in one morning. No one ever established. He had died in 1931. The record of the twins' birth had been filed inaccurately, listing them as individual births on separate dates. For 98 years, the error had stood. Hattie Monroe had spent her life knowing she was adopted, knowing something about her origin had been imprecise, and carrying the same window-watching feeling she could never name. Clara Briggs had spent her life with the same knowledge, the same imprecision, and the same feeling. Neither had known about the other. Until Denise Monroe, who was a retired librarian with a systematic mind and a subscription to 3 genealogical databases, had submitted a DNA sample for Hattie as a birthday gift in the year Hattie turned 97. And the database had returned a sibling match of 49.8%. And Denise had sat down on her kitchen floor and stayed there for approximately 20 minutes before she was able to stand and begin making calls. Nobody in that studio knew that the Sunday morning window watching was about to make sense. Both families had been playing Family Feud for 3 rounds, without incident. The production design had been intentional. Place the 2 women at competing podiums, let them interact in the normal rhythms of the game. Let the cameras catch whatever organic connection generated, and 3 rounds of footage would later reveal, to everyone who watched it closely, that Hattie and Clara had been watching each other with a specific, quiet attention from the moment they stepped on stage. Neither woman said anything about it, neither made a move. But the cameras saw it, and Steve Harvey, who was watching too, had felt the weight of what he was holding, and had said nothing and waited for the moment the card told him to stop the game. Between rounds 3 and 4, Steve Harvey walked to the center of the stage. He held the card in both hands. He looked at it for a moment. He looked up. He said, "I need to stop the game, because what I'm about to say is more important than any game I've ever hosted." The room went quiet. He looked at Hattie Monroe. He said her name. He looked at Clara Briggs. He said her name. He said, "I have a card in my hands that was given to me 40 minutes ago, and I have been trying to figure out how to say what's on it ever since. So I'm just going to say it." He paused. "You are sisters. You were born together 98 years ago in a farmhouse outside Greenwood, Mississippi. You were separated before your mother could tell either one of you about the other. You have been alive at the same time for 98 years, and this is the first time you have ever been in the same room." Hattie Monroe was silent for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Oh, there you are." It was not a dramatic line. It was a recognition. The sound of a word that had been waiting 98 years to be spoken to the right person. Clara Briggs put both hands over her mouth. Her son Thomas made a sound beside her. Denise Monroe was already crying before Hattie had finished speaking. Steve Harvey put his face in his hands. He stood that way for 3 minutes. Not a television pause. 3 measured minutes of a man who had been given something too large for the container of a game show, and who was simply letting it be as large as it was. The audience was completely still. A camera operator had set his camera down on its mount. The floor manager had her back against the wall, arms folded, eyes closed. 300 people sat in a room that had stopped being a television studio and had become something else entirely, the kind of space that only exists when something genuinely unprecedented is happening in it. Clara and Hattie were walking toward each other. They moved slowly, with the careful pace of women who are 98 years old and who have been moving through the world for a very long time and have learned to be precise about where they place their steps. They met in the center of the Family Feud stage, equidistant from both podiums. They stood in front of each other for a moment, and then Clara Briggs took Hattie Monroe's face in both her hands, and she looked at her, and she said, "You look like me," Hattie said. "I know." And they held each other, carefully, with the specific gentleness of people who are 98 years old and who have just found something they did not know they had lost, but who have, in fact, been waiting for it every Sunday morning at the kitchen window for their entire lives. When Steve Harvey lifted his face it was not composed, and he had decided it did not need to be. He said, "I have hosted this show for 23 years. I have hosted other shows for 30 years before that. I have never been in a room when something like this happened." He stopped. "I don't have words for this. I've been trying for 40 minutes and I don't have them." He wiped his face. "I'm just grateful I was here." He pulled out his phone and called a genealogical documentation service he had worked with previously. He arranged, live on the taping floor, for a complete legal and historical documentation of Hattie and Clara's shared birth record, a process that would involve the Greenwood County Historical Archive, a Mississippi State Records Amendment, and a certification of twin birth that would give both women the official record of their shared origin that the year 1927 had failed to provide. He committed to covering all costs. He said, "These women deserve a document that tells the truth." He announced both families would receive the full prize. He announced that both families would be flown, at his personal expense, to a private reunion weekend at a location of their choosing, where Hattie and Clara and all their combined family members could spend 3 days together in private, away from cameras. He said, "This next part is theirs, not ours." The episode aired 9 weeks later. The clip of Steve Harvey standing with his face in his hands for 3 minutes, while two 98-year-old women walked toward each other at the center of a game show stage, was viewed 430 million times in 14 days. It became the most shared clip in the history of American television in any genre. The hashtag #OhThereYouAre was used in 71 countries. The phrase was added to the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations in the following year's edition. Credited to Hattie Monroe, Birmingham, Alabama, age 98. Family Feud stage, Atlanta, Georgia. 3 months after the taping, Hattie Monroe and Clara Briggs had spoken by phone 47 times. They had visited each other twice, once in Birmingham, once in Memphis. They had discovered, in their conversations, that they both made the same cornbread recipe that neither of them had been taught by anyone, that they both kept a small Bible on their bedside table in the same orientation, and that they both had, independently, named a childhood cat the same name. A year after the taping, Hattie Monroe and Clara Briggs attended each other's 99th birthday celebrations. Hattie's was in February. Clara's was in February also, 3 days later. They had been born in the same week of the same year in 1927 and had never shared a birthday table until they were 99 years old. Both women watched the sun rise together on the morning of Hattie's birthday. They sat at Hattie's kitchen window, the one Hattie had been sitting at for 98 years, and they watched the light come. Hattie said it did not feel like waiting anymore. Clara said she knew what she meant. They drank their coffee and did not speak again for a while, because they had found that some things, after 98 years of absence, are best held in silence. If this incredible story of two sisters and 98 years of Sunday mornings touched your heart, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Share this with someone who believes it is never too late to find your family. Have you ever felt the presence of someone you hadn't met yet? Share your story in the comments, because as Hattie Monroe proved, sometimes the most important words in the world are the simplest ones. Oh, there you are.